continuing our reading from The Breathless, Dark Ripples, Part 1. Chapter 10, The Dance. Greg knows it's his responsibility to play it safe. Obviously, he can't count on Sherlock for that. For over 20 years, Greg had held himself resolutely from any and all temptation to seek out Sherlock Holmes. His reasoning had been sound, although backed up by strong anxieties. Had he found that there was no man in England bearing that strange moniker, it would be final proof of the mad delusions a part of him had suspected all along. Better, surely, to center himself within the twilight safety of uncertainty, to keep a tight hold on the possibility that he wasn't sick or crazy. Now he knows he's sane, or if not entirely sane, then at least validated. It's very nearly too much to handle. After the night of that brief meeting, he tries his best not to dwell on the implications, at least until the close of the murder investigation. A day and a half later, the break in their case does, in fact, come from the overhead blood spatter that Sherlock had pointed out. Greg feels a warm surge of pride when he realizes, though he doesn't say anything to Donovan or Berkeley about the source of the tip. The next morning, he sits at his desk, replaying every moment of the encounter repeatedly until it seems entirely unreal. And then, only then, does he open the Metropolitan Police Records search module. Sherlock Holmes, he types, one slow letter at a time. The cursor blinks patiently while he pauses to master himself, swallowing against the tightness in his throat and blinking hard. Finally, he moves the mouse and clicks search. Holmes, W. Sherlock, 1977-01-06. Records available. View. He devours every bit of information the system can give him, staring raptly into the screen as remembered images and details from decades of ripples begin to fall into place. The country estate, recently sold by empty nest parents, both retired from academic fields. The older brother, Mycroft, not Mycoff, as Greg had heard for years through a young boy's lisp. The names of the schools Greg had learned to navigate almost blindly. At age 15, mention in a local paper, second place award in a young composers competition for a violin and cello duet. Warnings for public disturbance, 2, no arrests. Finances indirectly controlled through a trust. No employment listed, but a last known address in the Shoreditch area. There's so much to take in that it's overwhelming, yet there's not enough, not nearly enough to satisfy him. He prints every page of the record, reading through it all again, and then he carefully slips it into a manila envelope and tucks it safely away. The next 2 months are all quiet. There are no ripples still, and no unexpected visitors to Greg's crime scenes. Greg keeps his ears sharp, but he doesn't hear of any of the other inspectors complaining about interlopers on their cases either. He's largely unconcerned by the lack of contact. As a matter of fact, he finds himself feeling more relaxed and healthier on the whole than he has in the 4 years since Nadia's lost pregnancy. He stops joining Ollie Berkeley for smoke breaks, switching back to the patches on impulse. His chronic indigestion begins to improve, and when he wakes in the morning, he no longer feels as if he's wrestled a bear in his sleep. Nadia begins to notice the change in him at home. At first, she doesn't really comment much. In fact, things roll along basically as normal until mid-October, when he sweeps into the kitchen one afternoon, humming an old Billy Joel tune he knows she likes, and pulls her into an impromptu dance. "What's gotten into you lately?" she asks him, smiling incredulously. "Nothing," he answers with a grin. "Just happy to be alive." "That might be a first. Tell me, should I be phoning the nice men in the white coats right now, or would you rather I wait till after supper, love?" "Oh, having me sectioned can surely wait, my darling." He pivots and tips her low, laughing with her surprised giggle. "You know how I adore your cooking." They dance a little longer as Greg returns to disjointedly humming the song's chorus. Nadia tucks her head in alongside his neck, breathing deeply to enjoy the smoke-free scent of his aftershave. "I remember when you couldn't dance," she murmurs as they turn and sway around the room. "Then I met a beautiful girl who taught me how." He feels her soft chuckle against his pulse. "You got lucky," she jokes. "I did," he nods. Slowing, he shifts and pulls back to see her face. "I got so lucky, dear. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean that, truly. I don't deserve you. The chances you've given me, so many chances, and I've blown it every time." "Ah, love." "I do," Greg tells her. His grin has slipped at some point. He clutches her hands, strokes his thumbs across her knuckles reverently. "I love you, Nadia. I love you so much, and I want to do better. I want to be better." Her eyes are shimmering with moisture now. He can feel a prickling behind his own as well, and he offers her a shaky half smile. "So, what do you say? Take a chance on this cranky old idiot again? Teach me to dance?" She leans up on her toes and kisses him, and it's like a jolt backwards in time. It's answer enough. On the first day of November, a double murder is reported in an otherwise quiet block of Islington Flats. It's messy, with signs of a long struggle ranging through multiple rooms, and after 2 hours on the scene, Greg's already giving himself a headache trying to sort out the probable order of events. For 20 minutes, Greg has been in the next-door flat with Berkeley, interviewing the old woman who had overheard the disturbance. Although she says she didn't know her neighbors all that well, she's quite upset. Enough so that she's begun slipping unconsciously into her native Czech as she tries to relate the story. She reminds Greg a little of Baba Kuzmina, and seeing her so overwrought is making him uncomfortable. At the earliest opportunity, he thanks her for her time and directs Ollie to finish hearing her out. When he returns to the crime scene, Sally is waiting, arms crossed and face more flushed than he's ever seen it. "Donovan, what's wrong?" "That asshole junkie showed up again!" "Oh God, he didn't." "He bloody well did. And the things he said to me." "All right, calm down. Where is he now?" "I very nearly punched his teeth out. The nerve of that punk," she splutters, clearly scandalized, "insisting he could tell me exactly what I've been up to last night. And where?" "It must have been somewhere interesting," Greg thinks appraisingly. She'd not be nearly so upset if he hadn't got it right. "And with whom?" "Calm down, Donovan. He's just a kid. Where is he?" She looks at him strangely for a second. Apparently, she doesn't feel that he and Holmes have enough of an age difference between them to warrant that term. "He's on his way to lockup is where. He was interfering in an active homicide scene. He was harassing me with personal information, and he was high, completely off his gourd. It was obvious. Are you going to tell me I was wrong to call it in?" she challenges, lifting her chin defiantly. Greg raises his hands, placating. "No, of course not. That was well done. I'm glad you were able to handle it. Now, back to business. Has Chalmers been able to tell us anything about the forensics yet?" It's a few hours before Greg wraps up the evening's work enough to return to the yard. When he does, he hesitates at the lifts. It would be best if he simply went up to his office, gathered his things, and went on home. He knows it would be best. The officer at the lockup desk doesn't even have to check his intake list. "Oh, that's the nasty ones with the running mouth. Coke, I'm guessing. Yeah, I put him in the little one, end of the row. Don't much fancy having to break up any fights tonight. Hasn't he got someone coming to bail him out?" "Refused his call flat out, he did. Says he'd rather stay the night here than talk for 1 second to that insufferable Pratt, whoever that'd be." Greg has his suspicions on that score, but he's still reluctant to assume that what he thinks he knows of Sherlock's life is the truth. "Right, well, I've got something to discuss with him. Shouldn't be too long." Sherlock's head jerks up at the rattling of keys in the lock. He stiffens sullenly as Greg steps into the small holding cell, but his disconcertingly pale eyes flit all over his visitor. Obligingly, Greg stops just within the door, allowing the scrutiny, to an extent. He suspects that if Sherlock weren't high, Greg's intense reactions to his presence would stand no chance of going unnoticed. And yet, were Sherlock sober, those reactions might be so much less complicated and difficult to mask. Greg recognizes the irony. You're the inspector that worked the bludgeon sculptor," Sherlock says after a long pause. straightening his seated posture in reluctant interest. The very same. It was the cleaning lady's daughter, by the way, just in case you were wondering. Of course it was. I could have told you as much, he mutters, bringing one hand to his mouth and idly tapping fingers there. You haven't even given me your name. No, I haven't. They stare at each other for a moment, sizing each other up, before Greg finally abandons his automatic reserve and somewhat grudgingly says, The name's Lestrade. So, Lestrade, how is it that you've managed to be promoted to detective inspector so young? Funny, most people assume I'm older than I am. Most people are idiots. Premature gray is hardly a reliable marker for age, or wisdom for that matter. Greg can't help an amused snort at that. This conversation already isn't quite going the way he'd planned. He takes a step to the side of the door, leans comfortably against the wall, and crosses his ankles, settling in. Sherlock seems to take this as encouragement to continue. Clearly, you've been a police officer for quite some time, upwards of 20 years, I'd estimate, but you carry yourself more like a beat copper than a slow, desk-loving detective, highly alert, quick on your feet. It's deeply ingrained. More than half your years of service have been outside of CID, but it's obvious from looking at your shoes that you've reached your current position at least 5 years ago. You really were fast-tracked, weren't you? Unusual. Blinking in surprise at the rapid stream of information, Greg shifts against the wall and answers honestly before he can even consider why it might not be a good idea. We had a retirement or two come up. Shortage of warm bodies, yeah? There was some pressure to find likely candidates to maintain the staffing levels. But I assure you, I put in hard work to earn my keep. Oh, I'm sure. You seem to have quite a complex about it, in fact. What's that supposed to mean? He receives only a nonchalant gesture in answer. They return to brief silence. This time, Greg studies Sherlock, while Sherlock studies the ceiling. Greg can see that the young man still exhibits some physical signs of his high, jittery movements of his fingers against the fabric of his cheap-looking gray shirt, unsettled eyes that alternate between not blinking and blinking excessively. But he seems to be trying harder to hide them, suddenly. He'd barely tried to cover his drug use at all when Greg had met him 2 months ago. If he'd been shamming sober even a little bit, it was only because he'd thought it could get him what he wanted. Greg wonders why he's bothering with it here when he's already in a holding cell for the night. That's not what he asked, though. Was there a reason you came round my crime scene tonight? Specifically? Yeah. If Sergeant Donovan hadn't cuffed you, you planned on what? Telling us something we'd missed? He shrugs. I probably wouldn't have told her. She's horrid. But yes, I'm entirely sure you have missed something. Like what? Greg asks, thinking of how sharp Sherlock's eyes had been to see the sculptor's blood spatter from the street a full story below. Well, how should I know? I never got in, did I? The short, unexpected laugh this draws from Greg echoes loudly from the room's white-tiled walls. It looked interesting. I was bored, protests Sherlock, sounding a bit petulant. I'm sure, Greg says, still chuckling with genuine affection, and all at once the reality of the situation comes back to him. I'm acting like I've known him for ages already. I can't be doing this. He mustn't know. It's like a spill of ice water down the back of his neck, and he withdraws immediately. The chuckle becomes a rough clearing of his throat. Well, good. I'm sure I don't need to tell you how it would look, evidence-wise, if you'd been snooping around in that flat before we got there. Sherlock's gaze sharpens on him, and Greg looks away from it, hardening his jaw. He's already planning his escape, mentally kicking himself for thinking he could handle a one-on-one with this kid. I've known for years he's bloody brilliant. What was I expecting? When Sherlock speaks again. So that's why you came? To make sure you weren't going to have to ask your forensic tech to rule out my prints and epithelials? Not a terrible reason, is it? No, perfectly valid, replies Sherlock, shifting on the meager pad of the cell's bench mattress. The word excuse seems to hang in the air. At least Greg can hear it. He begins to edge toward the door. Now I know you weren't in there. What's your ranking? Greg snaps his jaw shut in surprise. Sorry? There must be some sort of tracking across the division's inspectors, Sherlock presses, leaning forward intently. Isn't there? Closed cases, successful arrests, something to keep count of who deserves the Christmas bonuses. So what's your ranking, Lestrade? For a moment, Greg is baffled by the question. Why does he want to know that? He can't come up with a quick enough reason not to answer. "Third," he says curtly. Sherlock looks him up and down again. "You could be first." Again, something unspoken echoes behind the words, an offer. Up to this point, Greg's been torn between the irresistible desire to communicate with Sherlock and the instinctive imperative to get far away. Now, years of bottled anger surges up instead. "Could I now? And why should I listen to you? Look at yourself. You're high." "That didn't stop you making a special trip to talk to me. Why did you do that, anyway?" "Already told you." It's a game of tug-of-war, and Greg's end of the rope is slipping again. Time to get out. "Stop nosing around crime scenes," he snaps, "and clean up your act, Sherlock. It's getting you nowhere." With that, he pushes out of the room before Sherlock can respond. Motioning for the waiting officer to secure the door, he strides away angrily. He's out of the yard and halfway to the nearest tube station before his head clears enough to set aside the memory of that awful ripple 5 years ago, and the sick knowledge that Sherlock's continued to shoot up this entire time. "And how close did you come," he asks himself, "to letting it slip that you'd seen him doing it? That you knew why he was bored? Fucking hell, Greg." He thinks, no, he knows it would be prudent to avoid Sherlock in future. He resolves to try harder to run the young man off next time he decides to show himself around a case, if he even does again. If Greg can keep up a facade of gruff disinterest, block him from involvement, that's what he should do. It's undoubtedly safer that way. Greg knows it's his responsibility to play it safe. Obviously, he can't count on Sherlock for that.